Thank you very much for joining us. Hi, hello everyone. My name is Bilal Wahab. I'm the Wagner Fellow here, and I'm pleased to be joined by three distinguished Iraq watchers. Our guest from London and Doha, Dr. Ranja Alauddin. He's a fellow at Brookings Doha, among other affiliations. He is a astute watcher of Iraqi affairs, as well as the militias across the Middle East, and in particular Iraqi militias, which is one of the topics that we're going to highlight today, as well as the Kurdish affairs in the Middle East, particularly Iraqi Kurdistan, which is again of particular interest for us this afternoon. To his right is Philip Smythe. He is our sort of fellow here at the Washington Institute. Speaks Arabic and follows all of the fun groups in the Middle East, Shia militias in Iraq, in the Houthis in Yemen, of course ISIS and predecessors to ISIS, and children of ISIS that are being born. And today he'll basically address the role of militias in Iraqi elections, how they're transitioning from military victory and translating that into political prowess in the upcoming election. And the last but not least is Mike Knights. He's a senior fellow here at the Washington Institute. He's a known figure to you. He's an authority on everything Iraqi security, both formal and informal. So the order will be in the order of introductions. Ranj will address the KRG Baghdad dynamics as we head toward the elections. Phil Smythe will address the role of militias, and Mike will take us up to the 30,000 feet to focus on the IDPs, the security situation, but also what these elections actually mean for the future of Iraq. Let me just offer some very quick introductory remarks. The other day I had actually some Iraqis who came here to tell us about the election. It was a Kurdish delegation that we hosted here at the Institute. So we talked about the number of candidates. There are 7,000 candidates running in this election. We're looking at this is the fifth election that Iraq is going through. That 7,000 people are competing for 329 seats in the Iraqi parliament, and we're looking at over 250 political parties. So it was a discussion about who's going to win, what victory means, what kind of government will be formed, and what kind of coalition will be created. And then on the way out, one of my colleagues said, I can't believe we were talking about coalition building and parties and winners and losers about the Middle Eastern country. Usually when we don't have elections in the Middle East, and what we do is just a formality, because we already know what happens. But at least, given all of the pessimism around Iraq, that's at least one thing that's going well for Iraq, is that elections still take place, and they still matter. Matter of how much they matter, but they do matter. So I wanted to start with a positive note. This euphoria aside, May 12th is going to be an important date, because on the one hand, this election is just another election where some of the outcomes are predictable. The Shias will come out as the majority. It's not going to really shake up the political system. We're not going to have a new political system. Probably a Shia person will become prime minister. A Sunni might still be a speaker of parliament. We may still have another Kurdish president. There are talks about some changes in this that we'll get to, but we're not expecting any major changes. Some of the lingering problems that existed in the past, questions of fraud, questions of Sunni participation, remain to be issues in this election as well. But there are some aspects that make this particular election special. One, it's taking place in the post-ISIS environment, or at least post-ISIS caliphate environment. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. ISIS is still a problem. But at least Iraq went through a very, very tough 4 years. With ISIS coming in, taking over a third of the country, and not just resulting and inflicting defeat to the Iraqi military, but also to the very legitimacy of the Iraqi state. Here's an army Here's a military that doesn't fight, that doesn't defend the country, that doesn't have the capacity. And obviously that resulted in, most recently, encouraged at least the Kurdistan region to head toward a referendum in an effort to secede from Iraq and seek independence. Now, that didn't materialize to the desires of the Kurds, but that, the Iraqi troops went back and took some of the territories that the Kurdish forces took. But that doesn't solve any of the lingering issues that I'm sure Kakranj will get to. Another feature of this election is, we keep hearing about post-sectarianism. And while there is some rhetoric about the Iraqi identity and Iraqi nationalism emerging, and yes, some of the political parties are giving lip service to a demand from the Iraqi electorate about, how I was in Baghdad about 3 weeks ago, and I met with some of my older students, and they were telling me that, sectarianism has become aib, like a social taboo. And I mean, that's significant. And the fact that some of these political parties are, getting rid of the turban and putting on a tie, or changing the names from, Al-Hussein into good governance or rule of law, or like some of these sort of prettier, better sounding names, is in itself, even if they are, lipstick, as we heard yesterday at the Atlantic Council, I think they still matter. They reflect that the Iraqi electorate, the political elite, is attuned to the desires and the wishes of the people. So that's another thing. And then one other point is, again, the rising role of militias in politics. And then finally, all of this have different impacts for U.S. policy, and it's just an odd coincidence that the Iraqi elections and the American decision whether or not to withdraw from the JCPOA happen to be on the same day. Now, on that note, I'd like to ask Kakranj to address one of the issues that I highlighted, which is the Kurdish, Iraqi, or the KRG Baghdad dynamic as we head toward the elections. Kakranj, thank you.
Thanks very much, and thanks to Winnet for having me here. Special thanks to you for putting all this together at such short notice as well. I think without really hit the nail on the head, really, in terms of what the central theme of this discussion is or should be. And one can really take a glass half full or half empty approach when it comes to Iraq and its future. Crisis and fragmentation is certainly how I would describe where we are right now in Iraq, but opportunity as well. The post-caliphate political order that right now is in the making. And really, I do look at this election as a make or break of sorts. Again, because this is the first election taking place after not just immense suffering, but a period of 4 years where I would say each of the factions and parties have had to self-reflect and have come under such significant pressure that they truly have to or have engaged in critical thinking and self-reflection simply because that has been necessary for their survival. And I'll relate that to the Kurdish case in a moment. The story isn't dissimilar in Kurdistan as well. You can't really talk about Kurdish politics without starting off with the referendum. And I would say history will decide how that could have turned out, whether it could have turned out in a much better way for the Kurds, in a much better way for the Americans, but also in a much better way for Iraq. That was a crisis for Iraq as a whole. The way the whole mobilization unfolded, the tensions that have resulted as a result of that will be with the Kurds, but also the Arabs, whether it's Sunnis or Shias, Iraq as a whole for generations to come. And that, I think, ultimately is one part of the problem, where these short-term episodic events have a lasting impact on the psyche of the population, on the fabric of the society itself. Kurdistan right now, well, one could say that after the referendum and the events that unfolded, many did think Kurdistan was facing a existential crisis. At one point, there was even talk and gossip that the Iraqi forces, Baghdad, the PMF, could even move into Erbil and essentially end the autonomy the Kurds have enjoyed for a number of decades. And in that kind of environment, such volatility, anything is possible, especially when a momentum has been generated, because that momentum can take on a life of its own and it becomes rather unpredictable. The landscape, I think, is such that the Kurds now have to engage in a process of not just revising the way they've conducted themselves in terms of governance, building institutions, relations with the region, and relations with Baghdad, but also reassessing the relations and let's say the way they view the region as a whole. I think we're reaching a point where many in Iraq, not just the Kurds, but other factions, are viewing the future of Iraq and the region through a Iran-centric lens. Whereas before, many of these factions had a rather Western, US-centric approach to the region. Such was the belief that America, despite some of the recent setbacks and despite the disengagement somewhat on some level, it was a huge shock and a surprise to many within the Arab Sunni and Arab Shia community that Kirkuk was allowed to unfold in the way it did. Now, there is acceptance, of course, that the US doesn't want to necessarily have the kind of footprint in Iraq that it has had over the years. There is acceptance of that. But I would say something as simple as messaging and narratives has also really taken a hit when it comes to US policy in Iraq. So, for example, the narrative and the messaging that was coming out of DC in the run-up to the referendum, and then in the period leading up to the Kirkuk offensive, where it was clear that tensions were rising and that something was potentially in the making. Again, the signaling itself wasn't there, where effectively, whether it's Iran, whether it's Turkey, whether it's actors within Iraq itself, weren't given a green light per se, but were essentially told that actually America might not respond or react in the way that many would have expected before the referendum. The idea being that while the US might not engage the PMF or Iran's proxies in Iraq militarily, at the very least, they will play a more proactive, stronger role in trying to mediate the tensions. The referendum, I think, for it to have turned out the way it did, this is how I approached the issue personally. I thought to myself, 4 things have to happen in order for things to unfold as they did, each in their own right rather unlikely. The first is that the Peshmerga don't fight because of some issue internally, which of course happened, and I'll come back to that in a moment. Secondly, the US would intervene one way or another, put some pressure on Baghdad, put some pressure on some of the people and friends it has in Baghdad, or even just send a forceful message to the region, to Baghdad, that it will not tolerate the situation developing in the way it did. Third, that Turkey would be indifferent in the way that it was, which was rather surprising given the investments that have been made in that relationship between Ankara, but also Erbil and the KDP specifically. But fourth and finally, that the Kurds could potentially bank on the historic ties they have with some officials and parties in Baghdad. That at such a moment, perhaps those relationships could kick into action, whereby perhaps there could be some restraint on the part of the military forces. So if one was to ask whether each of these were a possibility before the referendum unfolded and even after the referendum, for each of those, the answer would have been unlikely but possible. But for all 4 things to take place within a matter of days, hours, was completely improbable, I would argue. However, again, this comes back to the glass half full or half empty approach to the issue. I would say the Kurds have learned 2 things, or should learn 2 things from that episode. One, do not depend on the US, and that is a lesson the Kurds have learned at a much lower price, I would say, than the rest of the region. So if you look at what's happening in Syria, there were such high hopes among the opposition, the rebels. That's one way or another, the US would play a more proactive, stronger role. If you look at the plight of the Arab Sunnis, they also paid rather heavily in Iraq over the past decade, based on the calculation that they have friends in DC, have friends in the US that could play a stronger, more proactive role in ensuring their plight wasn't so miserable. So they've learned that lesson at a rather, at a cost which doesn't even begin to compare to how others in Iraq and in the region have suffered. Secondly, institution building, good governance. This really did expose the weaknesses back home within the Kurdish leadership, within the political system in Kurdistan, within the KRG. And in the longer run, perhaps, if that lesson has truly been heeded by the Kurdish leadership, that will pay dividends down the line. However, Kurdistan is right now, aside from being rather fragmented, volatile, and that will continue. They will weather the storm, but the question is, at what price and for how long or how long will it take for them to get through this situation? There is a new generation of Kurdish leaders emerging. True, they also experienced the infighting, the divisions that unfolded during the Kirkuk crisis, again, at a much lower cost than their elders, because their elders, or the previous generation, learned that lesson by way of the Kurdish civil war in the 1990s. So how do they move forward? Do they have a unified vision? The KRG, the government, has served as a platform for coexistence, for power sharing, for the PUK and the KDP. But the KRG can no longer be the only platform for coexistence, for the sharing of resources and power, because quite simply, the resources are no longer there. So there has to be other means, other mediums through which the various Kurdish factions, the leaders, but also the new generation of Kurdish leaders can somehow work out a framework and accord. Now that particular accord internally for the Kurds is important for the rest of Iraq. One of the criticisms I've always had about the way we approach reconciliation and stability in Iraq is that we tend to focus too much on inter-community reconciliation, when in fact it should be intra-community. First, you enable an environment, assist, help the Kurds reconcile differences, become more unified. And then you move on to the various communities, and then you take it at a inter-community level. Because ultimately, any efforts at inter-community reconciliation will be upended by the various conflicted agendas, ambitions, politics, and ideologies that exist within the various communities from an intra-community perspective. What do the Kurds want out of Iraq? State building, I think, is still the essence of the KRG, of the current, older, and emerging generation of Kurdish leaders. That will continue to be the essence, I would say, of the Kurdish political spectrum at large. But right now, out of necessity, they are looking at Iraq through a Baghdad lens because of the geopolitics, because of the reality of of US foreign policy, because of the reality of the international order, one could say as well, perhaps. But ultimately, it's a question also that Baghdad has to ask itself as well, as does Tehran, because the Kurdish issue, Kurdish state building, with all the setbacks and opportunities and so forth, is crippling the Iraqi state as a whole, and it has done historically, quite frankly. So for the Kurds and the Shia political elite, because that's who controls the levers of power in Baghdad, they do have to go back to the era of the 70s, 80s, and 90s, where they fought alongside one another against the Ba'ath regime. How can that come about? I think civil society can play a much bigger role. I don't think the political elites are capable, have the capacity, they are fatigued, they don't have the energy, the creativity, and the capacity to even think critically, generally speaking, of course, to bring about that kind of change and reform and reconciliation. But there are actors further down, let's say from the bottom up, rather than the top down, that are capable of bridging these differences. They're the ones that I think have to be looked towards to establish a new framework that works for the Kurds and Baghdad. And then, of course, shall I finish up?
Sure. I mean, maybe I'll come back to where you take this analysis into Kurdish expectations for the government formation. Also, how much, what this election particularly means for the Kurds, given the referendum that's still very fresh in people's memories. And so what kind of expectations should the Kurds have, going from kingmakers to the referendum, to the failures of the referendum, and then moving forward. But given the sort of time restrictions, I'd like to move on to the next, and then we'll come back to this question in the Q&A. Phil, one of the elements that's unique to this election, I mean, we've had, militias participate in the previous elections as well, but this time they're better organized. They have more legitimacy. They have the support of the Marja'iyya, and they have also, they're called popular mobilization units because they are popular, in the war against ISIS. You've also studied not just militias in Iraq and the transition to politics, but also elsewhere. What can you tell us about what this means for Iraq and for this election? In other words, how concerned should we be?
Extremely concerned,
okay,
to put it simply. With the popularization of Hashd al-Shabi, which is, let's just call it what it is, it's Iranian dominated via the Badr organization, via a number of other organizations. They are now following the old Hezbollah model that we saw in Lebanon that worked quite successfully, where they have integrated this process of saying we need a militant arm and a political arm, and oh, by the way, we represent the nation. Our ideology, that's a minor concern, but we are actually the guys out in front here. We're the ones who are really protecting the country. We're the ones who are really protecting your interests. And oh, by the way, we have military victories behind us. So that means you can actually trust us. I had spoken to a number of militia leaders who are with Iranian-backed groups, and it was actually brought up to me, there's this issue that they kept bringing up, which was corruption. The Iraqi government, and this includes their factions as well, has extreme corruption. But it was interesting to see them kind of take on this line that they were willing to address corruption, why they were doing it for the martyrs. They were doing it for the Iraqi state that they had to defend at the Baghdad belt, that they had to really put up this fight with little arms, little support. They had no support from the Americans. This is one of my favorites that was dropped by one of the Iranian-backed groups that said to me, we got no support from the Americans. I said, yeah, you call us Shaitan al-Akbar. That's kind of why. You call us Great Satan. So it's just kind of this interesting line that I've seen develop. But I don't want to just focus on this militia element from the Iran perspective and just from saying, oh, well, they're going to dominate the field and look at how well they're doing. There's a whole other thing that's going on that doesn't actually get enough attention. And that's kind of this, we can broadly term them as nationalist types that are within the Iraqi government. I broadly list them as, you have Muqtada Sadr, of all people, who is trying to push that line that he is not just cross-sectarian. I mean, he aligned himself with the Iraqi Communist Party. If we remember a couple of years back, his cleric used to be Saeed Haqari in Iran, who told him, you can't run any of your people, any of your candidates, because you can't be part of this secular election that's American run, and it's all bad. And this is like the ultimate message back to the Iranians saying, you're not going to tell me what. So you have that kind of line, that trend that's there. And actually, in conversations I've had with Iraqi Sunnis and also other Iraq watchers, there's been this sentiment that keeps popping up, and Bilal and I, and also Ranj and I were discussing this, where certain Sunni communities are now looking at Muqtada Sadr, of all people. This is, his militia, Jaish al-Mahdi, back in the day when America was still in Iraq, was ethnically cleansing certain neighborhoods of Baghdad. But it is interesting, a lot of the ethnic cleansers are now on Iran's team. They've left Muqtada Sadr. They're no longer operating with him quite so much. He had that small push in 2014 where he pulled on certain sectarian actors to kind of send a message to the Islamic State, but then he pushed them to the wayside, said, get out of my camp. So there are Sunnis who are now coming back and saying, if we have to align with a Shia representative, might as well just do it with Sadr, because at least he's sticking by his word. He gets in fights with a lot of these Iranian groups. The Iranians are continuing to try to peel away different factions from him. One example just in 2016 was Jaish al-Mu'ammal. And if we're talking about the election, interestingly, Jaish al-Mu'ammal, which isn't actually participating in the election and is a kind of a portion of Hashd al-Shabi, they're now calling themselves Harakat al-Mu'ammal. They're now a political movement, even though the politics hasn't really been fleshed out. So they're dealing with a lot of this. So if you're looking at it from that perspective, being, let's say, a displaced Sunni, and you've had to deal with the Islamic State, you've had to deal with a variety of different Shia militias, you've had to deal with lots of problems in Baghdad, well, what else are you going to do? You might as well go to Sadr because he kind of comes off as an outsider. And mind you, he also used that corruption line as well, when he charged the Green Zone. And that also sends another message, about Iraq's leadership. Well, Sadr's willing to challenge them. So maybe we can go along with him. There's another group here, again, has not gotten enough attention. And I actually am writing something that's covering a lot of their moves called Tayyar Hikmat al-Watani, which is descended from ISKI, from the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq. It's interesting to watch the Islamic Supreme Council of Iraq and see how they are now morphing back into their old Iranian roots because the old school leadership has remained with that group. And also they've retained their militias. Whereas Tayyar Hikmet al-Watani, when they were formed, Sayyid Amr al-Hakim, who leads it, came down and said, I don't want any militia. I don't want an attachment with a militia. I want to have a civically minded state, or a civic state, as he puts it. And in doing this civic state, Tayyar Hikmet al-Watani's leadership, and I'm not talking about the younger school, but Amr al-Hakim was called into question a number of times. Actually, there was a munshid, there was a poet who came out and started singing a song against him and saying he was corrupt. So he's had to deal with a corruption issue too, but by saying he's dealing with a civic state, that he's pushing this, he's not pushing armed conflict or an armed group, he can take another element of this nationalist kind of potion, if you will. We want to build a strong, civically minded Iraq that's not corrupt, not beholden to, say, Iran, kind of promotes a certain Iraqi nationalist point of view. And we can actually do better than how we did before. Essentially, he's blaming the old school in many respects within ISKI for a lot of these corruption problems, and actually a lot of it does fall on their shoulders too. But he's kind of saying, we're charting a new course. Now that IS has been dealt with, yes, we have to mop it up. If you go along with us, then we're going to really take care of this situation. Some of these other militias, if we're talking about the Sistaniyin, the Ayatollah Sistani-backed militias, it's been interesting to watch what Iran has been doing vis-a-vis these groups. And I say this because from 2016 till around now, they've actually been trying to form different splinters within. And this doesn't mean that these groups are now beholden to Iran or chanting, the Baikiya Khamenei, and we want to support the Iranians. No, it's just enough to kind of peel them off of complete Sistani control, pay them a salary sometimes, or send them to a front where you can actually use them. And this has happened a number of times. And it's interesting, these groups have now retained their positions within al-Hashd al-Shabi. So you now have leaders that are promoted as military people who have a position that's within an Iraqi institution. They're not running for parliament, but they're now there. And it's hard to kind of categorize them as to where they really want to go. Are they still really answering Sistani? Are they a little bit more malleable? And are they going to answer to Iran a little bit more if there's cash coming in and commands coming in? So I think that's another thing to watch. And I'm a little bit more optimistic on this when it comes to the Sistaniyin, those militias, in terms of being kept within Sistani's ranks. Sistani has maintained a very, very tough order, if you will, when it comes to his men. And because of that, it makes it a little bit easier for him to make sure that the Iranians don't make too many inroads within his camp. I mean, they've done a lot already, but that's kind of where that stands. Touching on the Iran profile in terms of what they are doing, there's been a lot of talk about the Fatah bloc that was formed with Hadi al-Amri leading it. I have to say, out of any of the advertisements or graphics or anything else that was put up, these guys have most definitely spent the most amount of money. And they have done quite possibly the best in terms of their marketing ability. And I do want to say this. There was recent controversy. Nikesh actually brought this up in their paper about there's a billboard incident where there were certain electoral posters that were put over the posters of martyrs that were with al-Hashd al-Shabi. And I saw it right when it was happening on social media because I have a little thing that pings me whenever there's a different move going on. And initially, this claim actually attacked the Badr organization. This is Hadi al-Amri's group, the largest and most powerful of Iran's organs within Iraq. And they said that one of his posters was above the poster of a martyr. And how dare they engage in this electoral politics? This is disgusting. Almost immediately, when I say almost immediately, I mean 25 minutes later, there was a whole slew of other posts, not just from Badr organization. Actually, Badr took a quieter line to this. It was other groups that are kind of aligned with Badr. For instance, Harakat Jihad wal-Binna. This was one that kind of came up, and they had a video that they posted where they were ripping down an Abadi poster to get their Sarai al-Jihad, their jihad companies' martyrdom posters back up. But it's interesting in terms of the dynamism, just on that micro scale, the kind of microscopic level, that it's engaged like this very, very quickly, that they actually know the messaging that plays. I still have friends, some of them in Kitab al-Imam Ali, who are still posting stuff that's actually their coalition complaining about these kinds of.
Let me just interject a question here. So, when this kind of mentality goes into parliament, how are they going to behave?
That's a fun question. So for one, I actually think if we're looking at these groups, they're definitely playing the long game. If we look at how the Iranians have run this before, and I say the Iranians have run this before because a lot of these groups are directly controlled by the Iranians, they understand, one, there's a power in positioning things and saying we are civically minded too. And that, by the way, we know how to run a state better than these guys. They're the real corrupt ones. They're the real people who don't believe in the religion. They're the ones who are not doing the right things. But then beyond that, they don't want to become isolated again and look like what Sutter called these uncontrolled militias. They don't want to look like that at all. So I actually think there won't be the same amount of crazy infighting. Actually, I think what's going to end up happening is, and I've noticed this from certain violence trends that were going on, I think a lot of the fighting that will be between different factions, we're not really going to hear about. It's going to be kind of like that assassination campaign between Muqtada Sadr and Asayib al-Haq that occurred. No one in the West was really covering it. Even in Iraq, it was kind of like, whatever. They're doing their thing. When it comes to the Iranians, it's always that long-term game. And I don't want to give a bunch of DC cliches where they say, oh, they're playing 4D chess and da-da-da-da-da, but it is a long-term, slow process. And I want to go back to kind of the Hezbollah method. I don't want anybody in here or who's watching to think that, these groups are just militias one day and then now they've decided they're going to go into politics. Actually, the vast majority of them were political organizations with intertwined militia groups that were there before, kind of like Lebanese Hezbollah. So there's no real shift here. Actually, what I would say is just playing that message that there is a shift. So, you're seeing it from that angle. Over the past, 2 years, al-Hashd al-Shabi, as an institution within Iraq's government, has been trying to have specific brigades for each one of these political party militias. And it's interesting to see the political party militias will come out and say, we are Liwa 1, we are Liwa 6. And they're sticking to those kinds of terms when they're describing themselves. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that. They understand that they can't just say, we are Katab, whatever, we're just a brigade of whatever, and oh, by the way, we're in parliament. They used to be able to do that. In 2013, you had Katab Sayyid al-Shuhada, which ran on Maliki's list, State of Law's list, and they got elected. They got elected because they were fighting in Syria. That was the whole messaging campaign that they used. They can't really pull that off anymore. Now they can say, after our experience with the Islamic State, well, no, we're institutionalizing in this way. We have a disconnection from al-Hashd al-Shabi, and a number of these groups have also come out and tried to pull that. For instance, I brought up Harakat Jihad wal-Binna. Their main militia is Saraya al-Jihad. So the leader, Hassan al-Sari, came out and said, oh, well, no, we're disconnected from Saraya al-Jihad, which isn't true. But it was enough of a public messaging campaign to say, we are a political party, they are with Hashd al-Shabi. So we have some level of separation.
I'll come back to you with more questions about again those parallels between Hezbollah, which is has been through this, and then how these guys might actually deal with disagreements when they are in parliament, which we're sure they will be in parliament. Mike Nice, moving on to you, I have a lot of questions for you, but I think maybe the obvious one is the question of security. Is ISIS going to disrupt this election? They already gave us a taste of what they can do in Afghanistan. They had some resurgence in parts of Iraq. So how much of a serious challenge is this to this election? And then election, especially also in the disputed territories, both the threat of ISIS, but also the question of refugees being able to participate in this election. Again, we go back to the ultimate question of Sunni participation. But I also would like you to comment, on the larger picture of U.S. policy. The goals of the United States and Iraq being to prevent national instability, obviously ensure the flow of oil to the international markets, and then with this administration in particular is curbing Iranian expansionism. Is this election going to be crucial for these U.S. national strategies and goals in Iraq? I know I've just loaded a lot in there, but
get to it eventually.
Yeah.
Well, the one thing is for sure, however ISIS does during this election period, it can't have as much impact as it did last time, right? because April 30th, 2014, we went into one situation as the election happened. And then, mid-June, we were in a kind of different situation after Mosul fell. I mean, we knew already when we went into the last elections. I remember I came back from Baghdad just before the elections, and I thought Maliki Soria was gonna, was gonna scrape it. He had zero idea what he was going to do in the next term, zero vision. It was very depressing, honestly, but there was no opposition really. So it looked like we were going to have a nothing election. And then, 5 weeks into government formation, we have Mosul going down and a third of the country being overrun by a terrorist group. So I think one of the things that does is to say, let's all hold our breath, right? Because, in Iraq, the elections, obviously, you have the voting, then you have the government formation process, which is where the real business gets done. It's not really up to the people. And then, but events can intercede. Last time, I think it took 122 days between election. Was that time or was that the before time? Was that 2010? I can't remember which one it was.
2010.
Yeah. So one of them did, you're right. And then Belgium beat it. But anyway, it took 122 days last time, April 30 to September 2014. And, it's a question, was it quicker than it might have been because of Mosul? Or was it slower than it might have been because of Mosul? Did Mosul kind of get people moving? Might it have been longer without Mosul? We don't really know, right? But let's just say, we're running elections 2 weeks later this year, and if it takes about the same time, it's going to be late September 2018 before we get a government seated, assuming it takes the same amount of time. That feels like a very long time away, right? I mean, so much happens so quickly, not just in Iraq, but across the region. We've got a heck of a lot between here and there. So, a couple of things. On security, my feeling is that they won't have significant new impacts on the elections. Said that last time. and they, but I think, generally speaking, actually security is the best during election periods often. Historically, you often see a dip of SIGACs, the significant actions, because the security forces are usually on the ball and are actually, fully manned up and often manage these events and some of the religious events pretty well. So, you might get a spike in certain types of attacks, but generally speaking, the security forces do fairly well. I'm interested to see what's going to happen this time. One thing maybe we can follow, but is whether the Hashid al-Shabi vote in the ISF special election or whether they vote in the normal people election. Because it's very interesting from a couple of angles. If they vote in the normal people election, it's because they can't put a list together of their members. Right? They're a member of they're Iraqi security forces now, right? But they can't put a list together of who's in their forces to get them registered in special election. So that's interesting for that aspect, but it's also interesting because if they're voting the same day as the elections, they're going to be somewhat distracted. It's I don't know. So security-wise, likewise, if these guys are voting in the same polling booths that they're observing, that they're securing, the potential for some kind of either significant fraud or the perception of significant fraud is very, very significant.
Or intimidation for that matter.
Or intimidation, and obviously we know, any of what I've called in the TTC Sentinel piece I did on this prediction of where the insurgencies are going next, the colonization zone, which is a pretty big zone inside Iraq. That's the zone where the demographic balance is close enough that people are easy to freak out that IDPs won't be allowed back in or other people will be settled in their areas. And those are the areas. Honestly, Sunni violence around elections has generally only ever hurt Sunnis politically. It's always affected them the worst of anybody else. And if that's going to be, and honestly, how much impact is that really going to have, on this election? It's not going to change who runs the country. So I don't think it's going to be a big problem on that front. It might create disappointment amongst the Sunnis, but they're not exactly going to be jumping for joy anyway, whatever the result is. The third thing to add is that these elections are kind of weird in that we've got a unique situation. We've never had a set of national elections quickly followed by a set of provincial elections. And we've never had people spinning up to go into provincial elections as they're doing government formation at a national level. Often it's, I can't help but feel like it will have a slightly disruptive and complicating effect to have those two things, the tail off of the national elections and government formation feeding into the lead in to provincial elections. So it's going to complicate because, of course, in Iraq, you tend to have cohesive ethno-sectarian groupings during national elections, and then you get all of those groupings fall apart and compete with each other at provincial level. So, I know Sadr and Iski might be great pals during the national election, but a couple of years later, they're going to be cutting each other's throat or a year earlier, I guess it would have been, right? They're sort of cutting each other's throat at that point. So now they're going to be, all this stuff's going to be getting mushed in together. Finally, I think government formation is going to be interesting because I can't help but feel, and I was talking about this earlier, that attitude towards cabinet roles has changed a bit. Abadi's tried to get his technocrats, and technocrats sound really awesome as the minister. But I'm sort of starting to wonder now, actually, because, some roles you have to have a technocrat, but in many roles, I mean, look, even the oil minister, what's the big complaint of oil companies in Iraq? It's that he can't get anything done. He says he's going to do tons of stuff and do everything, but does he have any political horsepower? Sometimes being a technocrat is not enough. That's why perhaps splitting National Oil Company and the oil minister's role is a good idea, because, you need one dude who's got the horsepower, a big political party behind him, and you have the other dude who actually creates the options and things to do. I just wonder how Abadi's going to feel about the technocrat cabinet after the last 4 years. He might not be so zealous about it now as he was back then. And also, I think a lot of people have realised that being a minister is a mug's job. It's better to control the minister. Don't be the minister. Look at, I was talking earlier about how Hadi al-Amri was denied being the Minister of Interior or whatever. So he just had his two guys, one after the other, be the Minister of Interior, whilst he got to do 4 years of electioneering around Iraq, looking awesome, never having to go to the office, and never having to take responsibility for any bombing in Baghdad or such thing, which took out one of the ministers of interior from his role. So sometimes I think being the patsy is now you want to put a patsy in that position in a way, somebody who'll do what you tell them to. My gut would be that we can all think about fancy options for this, but the way the government formation is going to work. But unless something really, really, really different happens, because let's say Abadi gets a much higher than expected vote count, and his group, and that they get many more seats, and it seems like a real mandate and vindication, and everyone's kind of shocked. I think what's going to happen is that essentially what always happens, people are going to start to bandwagon. As soon as somebody seems to smell like a prime minister, everyone's going to just pile on him like a bunch of toddlers trying to make a acrobat triangle. They're all just going to jump on, and then suddenly you've got this big mush of people, and you have the government of everyone and no one again. Everyone's in it, nobody agrees what it's there to do, and it's just there to split up cabinet roles again. And I think initially something like Fatah, might not be Abadi's first chance to build government, but is he really going to be able to say no to them if they say we want to come in? Look at what happened before recently, when he said that I will welcome anyone into my alliance, and they said, "Oh, us, right?" And he's like, "Okay then," and then they're like, "No, we were just kidding you. We just punked you, right?" And so I mean, if they do it again, I don't know if he's going to be able to say no. So I think it's just going to become again everyone and no one, and that means the smaller parties, the Sunni parties, the Kurdish parties, anyone who can't unify as quick as the Shia, are going to lose all leverage. And if they get good ministries, it'll be because it seems like the thing to do, and internationals like that.
I'll use the moderator's prerogative to ask the first round of questions, Alan. I promise I'll get to your questions. But Mike, let me actually start with you. I know that the State Department said that we're not taking sides, and the United States is willing to deal with anyone that emerges as the next head of government in Iraq. But obviously the United States has, if not a candidate, but it has preferences. There are ways that it would be in the interest of the United States for these elections to go a certain way, and not some other way. What are the tools and strategies that the United States should do to influence, if at all, the elections and the government formation process, given our experience in the past?
So I'm tempted to say we should just stay the hell out, because we can often undermine candidates by our clumsiness. And if the candidate we want is going to win, he's probably going to win off his own back, not off of anything we do for him. However, when you then say that to people, they say, yeah, but the other side's going to be working it really hard, right? The Iranians, etc. And that is, convincing. You don't want to leave a vacuum. So, basically, I don't trust us, but I know it will send the wrong message if we don't appear to be trying, right? Because people have a certain expectation of us to be involved and so on. So, I think the best thing to do is for us to continually stress that we're behind the process and whoever wins is the PM. Secondly, that, there's certain things we expect, we hope an Iraqi government will do to lead its country, continue leading it in the right direction. And any candidate that commits to that kind of manifesto will, still have a strong ally in the United States. We need to meet regularly with people, demonstrate that we're paying attention. We need to be very mindful of not just what our actions convey, but our inactions. I don't think it's the time for us to be acting the way we used to in the past. I would rather we could act very different in this election and leave it to the Iraqis and trust them, because we might as well trust them. We have practically zero influence on this, I think. Really, we might as well be seen to be trusting them, to be seen to be treating this era we're entering now as a different era from the two previous ones, the one after we invaded and the one after we helped to defeat Daesh. This is a new era. So I would like it if we acted differently. But the problem is, as is often the case in the Middle East, you can have these good intentions, but you'll be misinterpreted. It's like the minister who decides to drive himself and nobody respects him anymore because he doesn't have bodyguards and an entourage. You can try and change the Middle East, but there's certain things you can't change. We've got to show a strong face. But I just think we should be very cautious and humble in this election, honestly.
Phil, you mentioned how the parties affiliated to the PMUs PMUs turned parties are behaving, in this campaign. How much of a preview is this to how they're going to govern, how they're going to behave in government?
Well, I think a lot of them have already had experience in government. In Badr organization, they're now running the Ministry of Interior. They've already discovered how you can use institutions to benefit your militia, benefit your cause. So I don't really think there's going to be a huge change on that. However, the issues come down to the smaller groups, and some of the smaller groups are a little bit more eager to do things that wouldn't be the best possible options when you're in government, though depending on their financing, depending on how strong of a leash the Iranians keep on them, and also what the Iranians want, that's kind of a thing that's left up to them. I'm actually a little bit more worried less about the ones that are entering into, well, some of them have already been there, but the ones that are in the governing structure, and more worried about the ones that are not. And I'll give you a good kind of example here. Qatar Hezbollah, big one, registered terrorist group in the United States. They have a political wing. Jazairi is their leader for it, but they're not running in the election. But they always kind of play this role where if they need to up the ante against the United States, against the Turks, against the Kurds, they play that role. Same thing goes with now a multitude of smaller militias that are technically Hashd al-Shaabi recognized, so they are part of the institutional process of Hashd. However, they're not in a specific brigade. They're not like put in Brigade 2, and they are now part of that operation. So sometimes they're engaged in, their own corrupt practices, or they're threatening people, or they are acting for other parties. And I think we've seen this historically with the Badr organization, what's now the Badr organization, these little quasi-splinters, even though they were still controlled by the Iranians, of Badr were going through and killing, let's say, people who were in Saddam Hussein's government, or they were threatening different places, and kind of doing this and that, and then they would just fade into obscurity. Maybe they'd run a guy in the election, but who cares? It didn't matter. They get like 6 votes. But playing a role like that spoiler role is what actually worries me more. And if they feel more powerful, which they should, given the current situation, then that means they can push their weight around a little bit more.
Mike, you had anything?
I was just going to ask you, Phil, do you remember there was a moment where the Sadrists started to kind of recruit technocrats and sort of good-looking, young kind of professional people? Have you spotted any of the Hashid groups doing that?
Oh, totally. And they will try to play that message, but what they've done is they've tried to combine it with and by the way, they also served in Hashd al-Sham. So you'll see that every once in a while. Badr has been much better at it than all the rest. I'm sorry I keep coming back to Badr, but they're the most interesting one out of them doing this. Asaibat al-Haq has attempted it, where they will talk about certain, like on the bios that they give for their candidates, they will say, oh, well, he was with the movement and he got this degree from, like a German institute, and he did this and he did that. And you'll notice they'll emphasize that, and oh, by the way, he got military training in Fatima, on the bottom. And it's kind of interesting to see how they positioned it. They're trying it a little, but I think give them a little time and they'll do more.
And do you think these people are actually meant to win seats in Parliament, or are they kind of the face of it, but there's like a ton more, actual fighters and stuff higher up in the list who would actually get the Parliament seats?
I think you're right in what you said, during your analytical session, where a lot of these guys are just, patsies for the higher ups. And meanwhile, everybody else is calling the shots. If you look at Hashd al-Shabi, they have an appointed guy who came down from Abadi, who is technically the head. But everybody knows that Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis runs the show. You're not seeing the militia groups putting up posters giving their support for anybody else like Abadi or the government. No, they put it up for Abu Mahdi al-Muhandis all the time. I think there's a lot of that still going on.
Kakranja, I know we're asking you to put you on Kurdish expert hat, but feel free to comment on the questions of the militia as well. But my question for you, actually, a follow-up on some of the things you mentioned. I watched the Kurdish campaign, and it doesn't feel like the Kurdish parties are competing for the Iraqi election. They're talking about, domestic issues, as if it's the Kurdish national election, given the fragmentation, but also given the air of the campaign. How much is this election going to change the balance of power within the KRG?
Let me just
please go ahead. Yeah.
What Mike said, if possible, in terms of his remarks on the US withdrawing from the entire process or leaving it to the process itself. I'm quite astonished by those remarks, Mike, because that would truly be an abdication of America's role in Iraq, its responsibilities. There are millions of Iraqis across the ethnic and religious spectrum that still today look towards America for values. They know America has invested, and they still have this rather, some could say, in today's world, idealistic appreciation for America. They still believe in the ideals, the values that America has historically projected, whether it's things like the rule of law, good governance practices, democracy.
Yeah, but don't chide me. I'm not talking about withdrawing from the country or the strategic framework agreement or anything.
I agree, of course. I know we pretty much stand the same side on this issue. However, on the process which you emphasize, the process in Iraq is flawed. It's messy, it's toxic, it's flawed. And when you've got Iran breathing down the necks of every faction, community, party, pulling their arms, it really doesn't make any sense to leave it to the process itself. And this election, like I said in my remarks, is make or break. And while the past 3 or 4 years has been a success in terms of defeating ISIS, the counterterrorism effort, the politics has been abysmal. America hasn't had a decent political strategy for Iraq and, for that matter, for Syria right now. Of course, we see the repercussions of that on multiple fronts. So that's why I think these elections present an opportunity to remedy the shortcomings of the politics. But for a change, America should back a faction or an individual, should champion an individual. That the time for withdrawing somewhat or disengaging has gone on past, I think.
We didn't pick Abadi, though. Well, they picked Abadi.
So Abadi, again, I think certainly if we look at Iraq, America isn't spoiled for choices when it comes to who could be the next prime minister. Right now, Abadi is the least worst option, certainly. That doesn't mean you can't pull the arms of other factions, try to nurture or foster some kind of US-aligned coalition. Iran is certainly doing it. It's done it rather effectively, successfully for years to come. So in a way, I would say in this highly personalized environment of politics and even warfare, America needs to take that individualistic approach rather than leaving it to so-called Iraqi institutions, which are ineffective, paralyzed, and so forth. On the question of the Kurds, I think you really hit the nail on the head because in my remarks, I was asking the question: have the Kurds reconciled themselves that they are part of Iraq and they look at the future through an Iraq or Baghdad lens? I don't think they have just yet. And again, this comes back to the essence, I think, of the Kurdish political and cultural environment, where it still is one that is orientated around Kurdish nationalism, the Kurdish state-building project. And of course, there are Kurdish elections around the corner as well. And this is the post-ISIS political order in Iraq. This is each of these actors staking their claim, and I would say even bring it down to the communal local level, in the local, let's say, political order. And you'll see the same with the Arab Shias and the Arab Sunnis as well. To a lesser degree with the Arab Sunnis, I think they are still in quite a precarious situation. But even among the Arab Sunnis, it's still rather Shia-centric, the way they look at and engage with the concept of Iraq, the construct of Iraq, Iraqi nationalism. Coming back to this issue of power sharing, which I think you touched on, and decentralization, I think we've got to start looking at Iraq through a power sharing lens. So going back to Mike's remark, it's not so much who becomes prime minister, which individuals or factions. In a way, you said in your introductory remarks, it's rather predictable. Some things are predictable. It's clear from which community the prime minister will emanate, and so forth. So in that case, let's start talking about the structural conditions that can enable the kind of reconciliation we want to see. And that should be power sharing. The Constitution doesn't provide the blueprint anymore. It's been weaponized, undermined repeatedly. So therefore, there has to be, we need to start thinking more creatively about alternative mediums that can, at least in the short term, provide a breathing space for that reconciliation and for that common national consensus.
Okay, we have half an hour for your questions. I'm going to take 3 at a time and then field more questions. Ambassador on the line.
Thank you very much. I thank you for this panel.
Thank you.
First of all, on the delay in forming the government, it may be that this time it will be quicker for the simple reason that the voting, computation of the votes and so on may be quicker than in previous times. So this is what what IHEC is saying, that this electronic voting, etc., is going to be able to produce results much quicker. Mm-hmm. So, Mike, it may not take until September, because many of the weeks that led up to September, immediately after the elections, were really devoted to counting the votes and checking the votes and so on. So we may have a little bit of a faster. I have a question for you, Mike. You talked about why be the minister when you can be the power behind the minister and not go to the office. Does this also apply to the prime minister's job? And in that event, in the jockeying for finding a candidate, nominating a candidate, is it possible for somebody like Maliki and Mohammed to want to be the power behind the prime minister and not the prime minister? Is that something that you envisage happening? I want to tell you.
One more.
But this non-involvement of the US, which I am sure a lot of people in Washington would agree with you. But if it were a level playing field, then it's fine. It is not a level playing field. And while the US is being hands-off and very pure about this, and non-interventionist and not meddling and so on, there is Iran, which is breathing down everybody's neck, twisting arms, imposing its will, and so on. And by the way, if Trump withdraws from the JCPOA, Iran will do it even more and will try to ensure that its will is done. So we don't have a level playing field, but there is a certain difference. And if you think about it, 2010, 2014, there seemed to be a tacit agreement between the US and Iran on who should be the prime minister. I don't know how that tacit agreement was arrived at, but there is a difference between kissing somebody to death and, on the other hand, creating some criteria. In other words, what is the kind of candidate that the US can accept and can work with, and what kind of candidate can the US not accept and not work with? Now, that is not the same as picking people. What you're picking is a profile. And the Iraqis can come up with, a dozen people. So this sort of holier than thou attitude, really, I'm very afraid of it because I don't know where it's going to lead. I don't trust the Iranians. And like our speakers here, I'm very worried about al-Hashd al-Sha'bi and about their will to grab power in Iraq. And I see no reason why Iraq shouldn't support them.
Well, do you mind if I just handle that now?
Well, there was a lot.
About
in there. Yeah, sure. Okay.
Yeah, let
Okay.
me take.
You got attacked twice.
I'm not
so
saying,
go ahead.
I'm not saying non-involvement. First of all, did I go on mute after the first clause of my comment?
No,
Like, the first clause
listen
was,
very carefully.
yeah, the first clause was, I feel like we don't tend to do any good when we intervene. The second clause was, but the other side's going to be intervening, so we have got to get involved.
Okay.
We have got to deploy individuals like Brett and Kirk. We have got to use whatever capabilities we've got, because if we don't, it will be noticed. It will be interpreted the wrong way. So, and what did I say? I said we should say whoever fits with this manifesto will get our support. So I said exactly what you said. We pick a profile, not an individual, And I think that's important because, that guy might not be a violent. But that doesn't matter. The point is, it's a manifesto. It's progress. It's moving the country in the right direction, which is what I wrote with Jim Jeffries recently. So it's not holier than thou. It's really, really tired of this shit. Just really tired. And I just really, we have not had great success the last few times we've tried to do real handhold sort of stuff. I think we need a different approach. That doesn't mean not being involved, but it means, I don't think we should be seen to be trying to pick a winner. And I think we agree on that.
Yeah, okay. I mean,
Dave.
Okay, thanks. I have to comment on briefly on some of the things that Ron said about U.S. policy toward the Kurds. And that leads to a question. First of all, thank you, Ron, for organizing the study tour that I participated in during the referendum, which was illuminating and had a catastrophic result. I mean, not our tour, but the referendum itself. But I have to say that the painting this as if the Kurds were promised U.S. support and didn't get it is not right. The U.S. was very clear that as a matter of government policy, the U.S. government opposed the referendum. And I was very clear on that. And in my conversations with most senior officials in the KRG, for what it was worth, obviously not very much, in the months leading up to the referendum, I insisted that while we would not stop the referendum, we would not guarantee the result in any way. And we would not provide, the U.S. government, would not come to their rescue if it had adverse consequences. That was very clear. And so that leads to my question, which is, but having the perception that the Kurds were somehow betrayed or abandoned or something like that, by the United States. I think, number one, or would you agree that that ignores the fact that perhaps the United States did have some role in preventing an even more catastrophic outcome, which would have been going beyond the 2003 Green Line? At least the U.S. government weighed in I think, a significant way to stop military conflict at that for an invasion of Arabia. Number two, does this mean for the Kurds, and maybe for the Sunni Arabs and Iraqi, fairly or unfairly, that they're thinking, well, we can't trust the United States, so maybe we have to put our eggs in the Iranian basket? I think you were sort of hinting. And I'll conclude with just this suggestion that came to my mind as we were discussing it. The new Secretary of State is heading abroad today, within hours of his confirmation, and he is going to Amman, Riyadh, and Jerusalem. Why doesn't he go to Baghdad? As a sign of an addition, as a sign of, there's time between now and May 12th, as a sign of continuing American interest in Iraq, without endorsing a candidate, obviously, but just, I think this would be a great idea. There's one thing that could come out of that we could headline from, and for that matter, go to Baghdad and Erbil, even better.
You know what happened when Ryan was going to do that, Speaker Ryan? They told him that he was going to have to not just they told him he was going to have to leave via Baghdad, as well as go in via Baghdad if he went to Erbil.
Okay.
And they
well, now the airports are open, so aren't they?
So still project
Kurds.
Yeah.
All right. So
okay. We're going to take 2 more questions and then get back to the panel. Nancy.
Hi, Yassine from the Embassy of Iraq. I have a comment and question. My comment is, with all the gaps that you have mentioned, Iraq stays as almost the only democracy in the region. So this should be considered as well. And my question for Phil, how do you imagine the situation when ISIS is on the outskirts of Samarra and Fallujah, as Fallujah is only 35 kilometers from Baghdad? When ISIS is on the outskirts of these places, and there have been rumors in Baghdad, I was in Baghdad there. There have been rumors that the U.S. Embassy personnel are packing. So how would you imagine this situation had there been no fatwa, no PMA? I just want an imaginary scenario.
I'm not a very imaginary person.
Yeah,
I can tell you what actually happened, and we can parry this around, pretending that Sistani was really the one who called up all these militias. It's good that Iraqis could mobilize themselves in a way to defend against IS. No one wanted IS to take Baghdad. Come on, no one would want that. Is that what you want to get out of me, or?
And it happened, but democracy is a process, and
okay.
Takes time to reach a better example.
Okay. I had a hand here as well, and then I'll get back to another round. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, I'm Jessica Dariagri from the Institute for the Study of War. Phil, you spoke a little bit about Amr al-Hakim and the national wisdom trend, and I'd really like to dig on that and up to you guys as well. I'm curious as to what extent you all perceive his rebranding as genuine, particularly given that his campaign platform is incredibly focused on the youth of his candidates and a very technocratic focus. And I'm curious as to what extent this is going to be successful, especially in Iraqi Kurdistan, in which he's running candidates in Sulaymaniyah, and what extent that could bring a coalition or post-election partnership with the Kurdish party, such as Homeland Alliance.
I think Phil already answered the question in the middle, so I can take one more. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Matin Malawi. I'm the media information leadership. Just one comment. I'm far from the topic. I appreciate the good knowledge that I get by the speakers. Whenever there is international intervention or endorsement for candidate or support, clear, something like that, it will damage it. And this happened in Africa. It's happening everywhere. It will be very bad for a candidate to be clear that supported by US. The ICC in Africa gives the presidents that guided by the ICC more power. The example of Uhuru Kenyatta, it could be clearer if the example of Sudan is damaged in the media. One of my best friends, who was in the campaign of Odenga, he said to me, I didn't vote for Uhuru Kenyatta, but I voted against the ICC because they want to stop a candidate. So if there is intervention, shouldn't be declared at all. Any endorsement from the government or any elites that representing the American policies will damage whoever gets it.
Thank you, sir. I'll make a quick comment actually on this dynamic between the United States and Iran and their involvement, if I may. I don't think Iran is actually picking people either. I think the game that Iran has upped the United States is that to basically manage the rules of the game in a fashion that however the election turns out and whoever becomes prime minister, Iranian interests in Iraq are preserved. It just becomes a matter of how much rather than a matter of if. Ambassador Crocker was speaking yesterday at the Atlantic Council, and he used a term that was nice, said that his goal was to hardwire U.S. interests into the Iraqi system. I think the Iranians have basically been more successful in hardwiring their interests, socially, politically, religiously at some level, and militarily into the Iraqi system. But the United States is also competing in that well. I mean, for example, economically, there is little that Iran can and has offered to Iraq. The kind of international support that Iraq gets from, let's say, the Kuwait conference is not something that Iran can ever offer or would have, would ever be able to offer. So that is the competition. And then if both sides are investing in the rules of the game, means the institutions, then who emerges as a prime minister is going to be less influential and controversial. Correct me if you think I'm wrong, but there were some questions here. One about let me see. I think I hope the questions as well about the Pompeo's suggestion of visiting the United States, Hakeem, and how serious this reformulation of his message is going to mean, and then of course the comment about how interventions often backfire. So feel free. Would like to go first?
I think David's
sure
questions. So it's always important to make clear. Ultimately, no matter what the US doesn't do, what other allies part of the Kurds do or don't do, the responsibility lies with the Kurdish leadership in terms of how things are done. Absolutely, whether that's divisions, the infighting, whether that's the miscalculations or not, whether it's the PUK, some faction within the PUK entering into an agreement with Iran. Ultimately, the problem is in the Kurdish backyard, at home. However, there were certain statements, messaging coming out of DC, which certainly created an environment which was conducive to the kind of actions and developments that we saw after the referendum. But you know this as well. The Kurdish leadership often assert it would have been much more ideal if the US had simply stayed silent, neutral. You can be anti-secessionism, like all other governments, more or less, around the world. But that's very different to actually saying, well, if Iran does this or if so-and-so does that, we plan to take no action whatsoever. So that's one thing perhaps the US could have done differently. Now, there is a stance to take before the referendum, but also one after. There are many instances, as you know, in Iraq, where not just the Kurds, but also other factions and communities haven't listened to the US, right? But the US has stuck around. It has asserted itself nonetheless, despite its numerous partners not listening to it on numerous occasions, despite perhaps certain US officials feeling betrayed by allies that haven't listened to them, but it stuck around. Why? Perhaps in the past, more so than today, it had a vision, it had a strategy, it had a set of ideals and goals around which it was engaging with Iraq. That all went out the window after the referendum. Hence why, coming to your second question, that sent a signal, not just to the Kurds, of course, but almost every other community, whether it's Arab, Sunnis, Shias, whether it's the minorities, that America simply can no longer be relied upon. They were, of course, feeling such a possibility beforehand in light of, let's say, some of the policies of the previous administration and the engagement, certainly. But I think that was truly the point where it became increasingly clear that perhaps it's time to look at alternatives. Now, of course, the Kurds do not want to end up in the Iranian camp. That goes without saying. They do want to remain in the, let's say, US-aligned camp. But does such a camp exist? Is the first question somebody has to ask. Because for the Kurds, but also other communities, this is existential, right? The US does have the benefit of geography. It is disconnected territorially from what happens in this part of the world. It's existential for those communities. It's existential for Iranians potentially. So that's why it normally isn't difficult. It normally isn't easy for the Kurds or any other actor on the ground to make a decision where they start not deciding, but rather looking at the possibility where they might actually have to reconcile with the reality that this is turning into an Iranian backyard. This is becoming, let's say, regionally, a Iran-centric region, the way Iran is shaping the political landscape of the region at large. And we're seeing the same dynamics play out in Syria with the YPG, where essentially, despite all the gains, the progress that has been made during the war on ISIS, politically, but also militarily, that's all being undone, I would say right now. I think it could be salvaged depending on what happens and what's said and done over the coming months. But we're seeing similar dynamics play out in Syria, where a partner like the SDF, where other non-Kurdish partners as well, are effectively being pushed into the Iran/Assad regime / Russian orbit of influence.
Phil, just a question about Hakim. How real is this transformation?
So I'm actually writing something about this without giving too much away on that. I will say, I'll give you a great response. I'm split in between.
There you go.
But I mean, I'll give you a few more details. I don't want to give you enough. I actually think there was some level of genuine transformation and change. I do. I think that there's clear ideological disputes that are there that are not really mentioned. Actually, instead, a lot of times you will just see this kind of youth line that's thrown around, but it's not necessarily a lie either. You are talking about the old school is now dominating ISKI. They're now dominating Jihad with Binna. They're now with all the other groups who are now kind of recoalescing around Iran again and giving these very pro-Iran messages, whereas Tayar Hikmat al-Watani is trying to give this more nationalistic sounding message. And actually, I do think in Kurdistan, there's always the possibility. You can see Amr al-Hakim has come out a number of times and tried to engage people like Barzan, who, was on Asayib al-Haq's, list. If you're watching their television station, you're going to see some nasty thing thrown out about him. So I do think that there is some level of legitimacy to it. And also, and this happened, I think, with a few people who were up in the Kurdish regions, anyone who was kind of aligning with him, there were threats that were thrown around, and there was a claim that I got, I remember we actually were discussing this, where someone actually had their house shot up. So I don't know who did it, but it seems like they annoyed someone.
That happens. Okay, I have 4 minutes and 2 hands, so we're going to take 2 questions and then 2 very quick answers. Dakhil and then Edwin.
Thank you so much, Dakhil from Voice of America. Good to see this. I got 2 notes, or I would say questions. As I understand from the panel, that you all the last notes that the Iraqis will not cross the line of the ethnic and religious diversity after exception. It's going to be the same. Prime Minister with the Shia. So if this is the case, what was Prime Minister Abadi doing? That's one. Second, going to characterize advice to the Kurds that not just or not to depend on the Kurds again anymore. But I think the U.S. and the other international players in Iraq were always using the Kurds to play the balance, to make the balance between the Shia and things. So are we expecting the same in the coming elections, after the coming elections? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bilal. Questions for the panel. I walked in here more optimistic than I am at this moment.
It's Iraq. It does that to people.
If I was to sum up basically what you gentlemen just said, is that Iraq's future is Lebanon today. Question for you: how do you, if that is the case, that Iraq is moving towards this Hezbollahization of where Lebanon is today, how do you slow it down through the lens of the United States? Is it empowering the Kurds and the Sunnis together? Is it just aligning your interests with Iran, and so you both have interests? Give us a scenario where the U.S. remains relevant in this, germane in this, and where Iraq doesn't end up where Lebanon is today. If Israel is offsetting or rebalancing Hezbollah every few years, who does that in the future with Iraq?
Okay, so we have 3 minutes to address these questions. Very briefly, I'll comment on what you asked me. This election is not going to transform the sectarian nature of Iraqi politics, but I do believe it's going to tweak it because the people are fed up. I mean, for example, if you are a Shia resident of Basra or of Karbala, okay, and the Shia has been in power since 2003, and then you look around and you say, okay, the Shia are in power, but what does that mean for me? For my jobs and electricity and services and my ability to have, prosperity, be as rich as the other, oil-rich countries. So it's time for it's not enough just to be Shia. Even the Shia have to deliver. Kurdish, right? Okay, here's Kurdistan. It's KRG. It's autonomous. It's selling oil, but people in Kurdistan are not angry as Baghdad as much as they're angry at their own government, because it's not enough just to be Kurdish. You have to be Kurdish government and deliver. It's that demand, that public pressure for delivering and not just preserving the sectarian, the ethno-sectarian identity. And that pressure is there. And what I see a positive trend is that the political class is at least responding to it. How deep that response is, how much of a lipstick versus a deep transformation this is, I'm not going to say it's very deep, but at least these guys are changing the names and changing their outlooks and the rhetoric. And to me, that's a positive sign. Again, this is it's a depressing topic. We have to look for things that's going to cheer us up a little bit. The other questions for the panel were Hezbollahization of Iran, which was Karwan's question. Then Kagdahi's second question was, can the Kurds be that, continue to play the role of the balancer in the Shia-Sunni dynamic? Who would like to take this question about the balancer? Okay.
So whether they can continue to play the role of the balancer, I think, of course, depends on how or to what extent the various Kurdish parties can unify their ranks in Baghdad. But if the US still looks at Iraqi politics and Baghdad politics through the prism of some kind of equilibrium where you have balanced distribution of, let's say, power and therefore the resources, that's perhaps thinking of 10 years ago, I would say, because the dynamics of authority and power, the balance of power has shifted too significantly, too dramatically towards one particular group of elite, the Arab Shia, of course. So if that's the thinking, the vision, or the strategy, it doesn't really apply anymore to the current political climate that exists. Coming back to my earlier point, I think what the US really needs to do is, again, breathing down the necks, pulling the arms in order to forge some kind of accord which accepts the reality. We are where we are now in Iraq, where power is certainly ultimately concentrated among a select group of Arab Shia elites and factions. Certainly, the balance of power has shifted in Iran's favor, and it will take many years, if not decades, of immense investment to try and change that reality. So we are where we are right now. But that doesn't mean some kind of accord, some kind of national framework which accepts the Kurds don't want to be part of Iraq, but out of necessity, clearly they do have to be, which accepts that Iraq cannot continue as it is without significant, genuine Arab Sunni representation in Baghdad participation, and which accepts that within the Arab Shia community that there are Western US aligned actors that can constitute some kind of check on the Iran aligned factions. That doesn't need necessarily an immense footprint as the US did in the past. That just needs greater investment and dedication to the politics.
Mike, you get the last minute.
Right, so I'm always optimistic about Iraq compared to a lot of people. I think that's partly because I've totally lost perspective, and my goalposts have been moved so much over the last 10 years that what I see as a good outcome, everyone else thinks is bloody awful. But anyway, I think we have an important role going forward in Iraq, and I guess what I feel like nowadays is like we're not the brain surgeon, right? We're not that good, but we're a doctor. We can help, and I think, for instance, our role is to counterbalance Iran, give the Iraqi government options. We might be their backup. They need that backup. It actually stops Iran from getting total dominance there. Senior Iraqi politicians, a number of them have said to me, if we have the backup option of America, then the Iranians treat us different. There are limits on how far they can push us, etc., etc. And that fits with the KRG as well. I think there's many unique roles the US plays that nobody else can. Who did the Iraqis go to when Mosul Dam was breaking? They go to Iran, the guys who can't even finish Sadr power station, right? No, they went to us and they went to the Italians. They went to their coalition partners. So, we have many key roles. World Bank, IMF, Kuwait, Saudi, bring the Saudis to the table, Mosul Dam, etc. There's still CTS, intelligence, all this stuff. Like they know what we can do. This Iraqi generation wants something new, but this election's not going to deliver it. You can just tell they're ready for something new, and Abadi's the closest thing to it, but he's not it. And so I think it's going to create a lot of thirst, maybe some in the provincials, and definitely by the next set of national elections, and definitely protests in between here and there. And then finally, I think, security-wise, we've hit the bottom, and we're bouncing up slowly, like a submarine that got sunk on the bottom of the sea, and they just start to refloat it slowly. We're in a better place than we were. I mean, honestly, this is, in many ways, and this doesn't count for the Kurds, unfortunately, but this is a stronger country than it was in 2014, in my respect. I think back then it had cancer. Now it's in remission, it's recovering, and it's learned something in the process. This coalition is better than the coalition we had in Iraq in 2003 to 2011. It's truly multinational. And I think it's willing to do the right thing with this country. Likewise, the ISF leadership, the Iraqi Security Force leadership we've got now, it got fixed in 2014. And everything has been better since then. And if they don't mess it up like they did in 2011, then they'll come out this with a great leadership. The one thing that really worries me about Iraq is, I think they've learned a lesson on security. I think the Sunnis have learned a lesson. But they haven't learned a lesson on two things. They haven't learned a lesson on the importance of Baghdad KRG accord going forward, and the fact that, ultimately, I think if they take the lesson that this is going to be one happy family with no concessions, with no return to Article 140, then they're dreaming, and there's massive trouble down the line. And the second thing they haven't learned from is they haven't really learned the lesson of the economic crash. It's going to take another massive oil price crash to wake them up, because they, as usual, as soon as the prices have gone back up again, they've forgotten the lesson.
Hence the words of the doctor. Thank you very much for joining us. This was a very lively discussion. Have a nice evening, and thanks again. Please join me.